Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Kris Hartley. I'm a PhD candidate at the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I want to thank the Center for the invitation to speak. I want to thank Professor Yim of the Government Competitiveness Center at Seoul National University, and also my colleagues at the Government Competitiveness Center have been very warm and welcoming during my stay here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight about the book that I recently published several months ago, entitled Can Government Think? Flexible Economic Opportunism and the Pursuit of Global Competitiveness. You see here, for anybody who has published books with Routledge, that they did not give you a choice of the cover design. It was simply given to me, and I couldn't help but notice that it is quite similar to the cover design for 50 Shades of Grey, which is the bottom right. Though I can assure you that this book is probably not quite as exciting as that one. Nonetheless, we will dive right in. Begin with a quote, Marxian perspective, not that Marx, but the other Marx, the Groucho Marx. Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. Well, this pretty much covers the entire policy cycle, in my view. And found it rather interesting to think about this quote in the context of what we're facing today in our political and policy-making environments. So what was the inspiration for this research? You may recognize these individuals as American politicians. They are congresswomen and congressmen who have significant power and yet have been unable necessarily to work together for various reasons. The clips that I have here are from the 3 government shutdowns or near government shutdowns in American politics in the last 20 years. The one on the left in '94, the one in the middle just a couple of years ago, and then the one on the bottom right was a threatened shutdown very recently of Homeland Security and other departments, primarily over political gridlock. So my question then at the bottom left, is there a better way? So the problem then we've seen is finding trouble everywhere. This is generally the policy challenge of any government in its pursuit of competitiveness. What is the cause of finding trouble everywhere? Well, bad policy is often the cause. In other words, Groucho Marx's wrong remedies. The culprit is that governments don't think in a general sense, and I'll explain what that means later. And the research question, therefore, becomes, can government think? And not only can, but how? So in this presentation, I will review the main points, conceptual origins of my theoretical framework, the practitioner and theoretical perspectives. And then I'll go into the integration of literatures. There are 3 literatures which I bring together in this study: institutional economics, public administration, and evidence-based policymaking. And I will conclude with 4 cases, not in great detail, but enough detail to illustrate the theoretical approach that I'm taking in this book. We'll close with several lessons and perhaps, if time, some questions and answers. This is a direct quote from the book. It's the only one in the presentation I will subject you to. The post-partisan approach of flexible economic opportunism, which is the phrase in the title, does not prescribe a universal policy or model, as we've seen so often in development programs in the Bretton Woods era, for instance. Rather, it establishes the conditions for existing governance structures to adapt more quickly to economic cycles that are becoming shorter and more severe. We've seen evidence of this, particularly in the last few years. This pragmatic, reform-minded approach values institutional flexibility, innovative governance, and a robust focus on evidence. Those 3 things, of course, align with the 3 literatures that I'm covering in the book. So, the main point, the question is, therefore, can government think? Multiple choice, here we are at a university, it's appropriate to make it look like a test. Anybody would answer, probably it depends, which is the favorite answer of such a question in the field of social sciences. The bottom one, of course, being probably a technocrat's approach to the matter, but here I'm really thinking about what conditions it depends on. My argument is flexible opportunism is alignment of institutional norms and administrative structures to foster the development of evidence-based policymaking. So this is how the 3 literatures fit together. Institutional norms and administrative structures can be designed in complementary ways to enable evidence-based policymaking, which of course I ultimately argue goes beyond the simple points of ideology and political gridlock. Now, what does this look like in a practitioner's sense? Adaptability and pragmatism are really at the heart of this theoretical paradigm, which favors these items over ideology and patronage. Timely accommodation of global trends, so this is the opportunistic element of that, to survey the realm of opportunities globally, particularly in economic opportunities, and to determine which of those opportunities align with a country's own capabilities and comparative advantages. The approach is also ideally, I emphasize, neutral regarding belief systems, which is essential when talking about evidence, because one could argue that evidence is the enemy of ideology in a way. Evidence normalizes views and puts the facts on the table. And it accommodates the will of the state while maximizing competitive potential. Now, I described the will of the state, and it's a loaded phrase. This theoretical approach does not presuppose any particular type of political system. It does not say that the system needs to be authoritarian or democratic or some hybrid thereof. So when I say the will of the state, I mean however the will of the state is determined in any number of different political systems. So this, in a way, does maximize, hopefully, the applicability of the model to various different types of governments and situations. So now that is the practitioner's view. The theoretical view I'd like to get into now. Those familiar with institutional economics may recognize this goods matrix of Ostrom and Ostrom. And what you have across the top there is called jointness of use. Alternative use is basically, we're talking about goods now. Alternative use is the zero-sum outcome. What I use cannot be used by somebody else. If I buy a particular loaf of bread, it cannot be consumed by anybody else. This is in contrast to joint use, of course, which is more of a public good type approach, at least when the exclusion is infeasible. So this is a total good. And this is basic economics that we've heard. On the left side, of course, we've got the ease of exclusion. So in other words, can we exclude people from consuming these products? A feasible exclusion, or basically low-cost exclusion, would apply to private and toll goods. In other words, we can keep people from consuming them. I can keep somebody from consuming my own shoes, for instance. Versus infeasible exclusion, which is basically a free-for-all. People have access to certain goods, and it's very difficult to exclude them. So now what I'm focusing on is the bottom left quadrant of this matrix, the common pool resource, because I am establishing an analogy here. Ostrom talks primarily about environmental resource management, so water from sources that can be used by anybody. But my argument is the common pool resource can also be used to understand the global economic environment. And this is where I bring in the term adaptive governance for the rest of society. Now, adaptive governance is fairly common in the literature and pertains mainly to environmental resource management. It's how can a system recover and sustain itself through various exogenous shock events. I'm arguing that we have looked at socio-ecological systems in this way, but we can also look at economic and policy-making systems in this way. So what I've broken down is characteristics and theoretical conceptualization. The characteristics of problems. Now, these two things, keep in mind, are what I'm applying both to environmental systems and to economic systems. The complexity, uncertainty, and fragmented management. These are characteristics that apply to both. And the theoretical conceptualization of problems, a common pool resource. We've already seen in the previous slide that the common pool resource is infeasible exclusion in joint use. In this case, I'm arguing that the global economy represents the same characteristics as a common pool resource. So on the left, we have the way adaptive governments would envision this. A tragedy of the commons, the overconsumption of public goods, the lack of exclusion, the lack of ability to charge, has led to the need for adaptive governance in certain situations. In the economic sense, diminishing national competitiveness, the global economic uncertainty that we've seen in the last several years, and arguably across the century, has led to the need for flexible economic opportunism, which I say is similar to adaptive governance in that it has some of the same characteristics. So again, this is the theoretical ground on which I'm building the argument within more specific, because that may not have been entirely clear, I have broken down the comparison of adaptive governance and flexible economic opportunism in the context, applied approach, and conceptual basis. So the context, as I've mentioned already in adaptive governance, is environmental laws, which are observable and arguably predictable. Now, the way that we interact with our environment sometimes is not predictable, based on the fact that we have pollution, environmental degradation, and overconsumption. Now, in flexible economic opportunism, I'm arguing, however, that beyond the laws that are observable and predictable, that economic phenomena are fundamentally irrational, unpredictable, and imperceptible in some cases. Clearly, we saw a case in which economists, leading up to the global financial crisis, were quite sanguine about economic circumstances. And there has even been several articles out talking about the fact that very few people predicted what would have happened. And so it's arguably, even among the most noble scholars, difficult to predict economic phenomena. The applied approach is a very important distinction between the two: reactive versus proactive. Adaptive governance is reactive. So what happens that is unpredictable to an ecological system has to be responded to in some certain way. So it's a defensive type of approach, whereas flexible economic opportunism is, I argue, in a sense, proactive. It's surveying, as I say, the realm of opportunities, calibrating a strategy, an economic strategy through policy or otherwise, based on appetite for risk and return, which of course will vary across countries and across political cycles as well. And finally, the conceptual basis: resilience and multi-level environmental governance is the basis of adaptive governance, where I argue that flexible specialization is for flexible economic opportunism. Now, you may be familiar with the literature about, for instance, the Third Italy, talking about the flexible specialization of clustering of firms. Many small firms specializing in particular things, and therefore creating sort of this symbiotic ecosystem of small productive activities that can either expand or contract based on market conditions. Well, I argue that this also can be applied to sort of national level economic policy in specific regard to differentiation, adaptive capacity, and institutionalized innovation. So these are all things I could go into more detail about, but in the interest of time, I will simply lay those out there. So that's the conceptual foundation. Now we move to the second part of the presentation, which is the literature, which is going to be important in establishing the academic or scholarly credibility of a work such as this. So the logic of my literature basis here is what I call the funneling of the breadth of agency in the many contexts where governance and society interoperate. So funneling, by which I mean in this sort of inverted triangle, is not random. It actually expresses that the institutional dimensions are the broadest, followed by sort of the public administration dimensions, and then followed by evidence-based policy. So institutional economics speaks not only to government policies and development. Institutional economics is remarkably broad, especially when you talk somebody like Douglas North, historical institutionalism. Things cover society, they cover economics, they cover politics. So I think this is a good overarching way to approach these problems. Norms governing civil society. Public administration narrows that focus to more sort of what I call the practices of official. In other words, the things that are within the purview of government, the scope of government. And in different countries, the appropriateness of the scope of government obviously will be decided differently, and evidently is certainly very different across countries. And finally, evidence-based policy is very specific. It's that very last thing, what I call a policy product. It's the outcome. The outcome is not necessarily, I'm not talking about an outcome in a societal outcome like higher reading scores or longer human longevity. I'm talking about just a policy outcome. Is it a good policy? Because right now I'm not attempting in this book to measure, to do a policy analysis. I'm only describing how a policy gets produced and gets arrived at. So empirical research and information democratization. This last point is really speaking more to sort of ICT and technological innovation that has actually brought about more transparency in the governance processes in some, but not all countries. So, back to institutions. One slide here on institutions. I see the bedrock unit of analysis So definitional ambiguity is something that we face when studying institutions. Our inclination is to think of an institution as an organization, a school, a government agency, a university. But in fact, institutional definition can go far beyond that. Rules, norms, and practices, what they would call the rules of the game, so to speak. So this is fundamentally a very overarching way to conceptually approach what we're talking about. Within this overarching concept are the various theoretical issues which have been approached. Property rights, very specific in terms of determining the allocation of property rights, therefore leading to economic development. There's been quite a bit of research on that. Transaction cost theory, which spills, of course, over into management sciences as well, and social contracts, particularly the work of the Ostrums, you see up in the top left, Lynn Ostrom and her husband, and by the way, it's Douglas North there in the bottom left. And in this case, we have a situation where institutions refer to the presence of a variety of scales and to the role of attitudes and behaviors in influencing governance. Second literature is public administration. The analytical boundaries are a little more strictly defined, which makes it arguably a bit easier to look at. The degree of intervention ring fences government, as I say, and policy processes would be probably more easily researched. There is a logical, in my mind, progression of theoretical paradigms within public administration, although I would certainly welcome any challenge to that statement. You have Wilson's public administration dichotomy, which is sort of a foundational work in conceptualizing the state. There's Taylorism in scientific management, which was also sort of worked its way into public administration studies in the very early stages, early part of the 20th century. And then around the mid part of the century, Waldo coming out and challenging this dichotomy idea, saying that it's actually useless to think of it in terms of a dichotomy, and a bit more in terms of the service of the public. And that gave birth more to sort of NPA, New Public Administration, the Middlebrook Conference, some of these that are trying to establish the need to look at public service more broadly, rather than just simply the operational aspects of administration. And then the rest of the new public management obviously coming out as a reaction to sort of the larger interventionist and Keynesian types of theories. CG, collaborative governance, GC, government, competitiveness, and POMO, postmodernist, constructivism, deconstructivism, and so forth. I put FEO up there. Doesn't really fit public administration paradigm, so maybe there's a role for it. So the structure of public administration, speaking to the ordering of administration within systems, and the dimensions of autonomy, collaboration, and jurisdictional overlap. These are all dimensions on which government systems can be measured and compared and arguably improved as well. And then we have to give a nod towards standards as well. Competence and ethics, leadership both the individual level and at the organizational level as well. The last literature, evidence-based policy, some may recognize Stephen Colbert there, the concept of truthiness, which really does actually, even though it's a comedic construct, actually does speak to how evidence is used in the policymaking process in many instances today. It is a truthiness, what appears to be truth, but is actually ideologically founded and ideologically based. So what is the role of research? Understanding problems, identifying solutions. We again get back to Groucho Marx's quote. The incorporation of information and ideally the neutralization of ideology, although this may be a bit quixotic to think that could actually accomplish this. Theoretical bases for epistemological approaches also. So when we talk about evidence-based policy, we have to talk about how knowledge is formed to begin with and how it's developed, empiricism, constructivism, etc. So these are all things that need to be considered when we bring evidence into the discussion. The nature of problems and the perception of evidence, which will show up in a couple of my case studies. The perceptions of evidence being what may appear to be fact can also be a matter of interpretation. And this is a challenge in evidence basis. And finally, you have research design, which I talk a little bit about in the book, connecting academia and practice. And there is literature on the value of importing theoretical or academic knowledge into actual policy making. The degree to which this actually occurs though it's probably fairly limited in comparison to what it could be, and certainly the benefits that it could bring. So those are the three literatures. This slide, putting all the literatures together, in other words, it's the so what, it's the why. The institutional economics grounds policymaking and the nuances of human interaction. And it was that overarching approach. And accounts for variability across political and social systems. So it is relevant to use, regardless of the type of political social system, therefore it may be applicable to a larger array of countries. Public administration simply situates analysis within the constraints, realities, and objectives of modern governance systems. So that definitely takes that and narrows it down. And finally, evidence-based policy attempts to neutralize ideology, the accompanying gridlock and manipulation of facts, territoriality, and other habits. And systematizes the analysis of evidence, which is absent in many policymaking processes today. And data is not enough. So I have laid out the concept of the book. I've laid out how I'm approaching these problems and what the literatures, the three different literatures, allow me to do, allow me to get into. So now I will, the second part of the presentation, talk about 4 different cases. Pictures here are to prove that I've been there. So each of them actually does pertain to all 3 of those literatures in certain ways. And I'm going to talk about a case, for instance, in Auckland, where institutional reform has changed the balance of power. Rural Thailand is a case where under-institutionalized feedback mechanisms for grassroots activism have failed to create policy change. Richmond, California, a project I was working on for quite a while, how evidence overcomes political barriers to change policy. And finally, fracking, hydraulic fracturing, which is actually part of the new energy revolution as a new way to extract shale gas. And America's been benefiting immensely from this, but possibly to some environmental degradation. So that case examines how people have brought these concerns in front of policymakers. So to begin with New Zealand's urban growth. So in 2010, Auckland amalgamated. Basically, Auckland was 7 or 8 different individual municipalities, and there were some efficiencies to be achieved by breaking them all under one umbrella. And that's what happened. So we went from small to actually a very large metropolitan area, which constitutes over 1/3 of the country's population. Auckland faces underinvestment in infrastructure, underinvested transport infrastructure, fairly low level of public transport service in comparison to benchmark cities, and therefore a need to invest a lot. And political contention. So this is really the heart of this case, central versus local. The central government, the national government, versus, well, the national party, I should say, which is under sort of more, I guess, casual terms, can be called the right, fairly conservative government, versus the other party that's commands the power in Auckland City, which is in council and the mayor, who are not national party, they are more the left party. So the findings here are that institutional reform. Now, the institutional reform was the amalgamation of the council. That is what I refer to as institutional reform. Altered the balance of power between central and local government. It's basically a divide and conquer thing. Prior to amalgamation, smaller governments didn't have as much sway because they didn't have as much population or representation or even capital to invest. Now with this massive behemoth, this one big government, serving as a counterbalance to the national government, it's very critical because this has actually raised the prospect of more even negotiations between the central and the local government in procuring the infrastructure, particularly that transport infrastructure, which I said that Auckland is so badly in need of at this point. Increased local government autonomy. Another critical aspect to amalgamating is increasing the asset base so that the city can borrow more against its own asset base, which I think stands in the neighborhood of $30 billion now. To borrow against that to develop this infrastructure. And the central government has ultimately been forced to cooperate on some aspects of what they would consider a rival growth vision, which is basically a pro-public transport, pro-density, and anti-sprawl type of approach. The methods here, I won't talk too much about them. Document analysis and first-hand experience. I worked for 2 years within the New Zealand government, and these are based on the operative observations and experiences I had there. The contribution is the connection between public administration and institutional forces. So the governance restructuring, that was the institutional transformation. And the connection between the reflection of new institutional norms in administrative structure, by which I mean the larger council now has more power to exert its political vision in its own development. And policy making emphasizing evidence over ideology, which I argue there is plenty of evidence in Auckland for the need for further transportation, infrastructure, and other types of infrastructure such as social housing, health, recreation, etc. Just a few examples of this case. On the left, I've got the central government, national party, and local government, Auckland Council, and sort of their rival positions on key issues. Central government wants invested in roads. RONs is the roads of national significance. These are roads around the country, highways. In other words, we're favoring freight movement, we're favoring personal automobile ownership. Whereas the local government investment in public transport. The CBD loop refers to a subway system that goes through downtown Auckland, which the National Party has opposed as being unnecessary and too costly. But Auckland Council has argued is critical for maintaining Auckland's competitiveness in a global economy by at least providing something that most other decent-sized cities would have, and that is high service public transport. Second is urban sprawl. By upzoning, we mean densification. So if you have one house per acre, then the upzoning may allow 2 houses per acre. This is very critical because in cities, particularly in America, where there's very low density, public transport is not necessarily that feasible. So high density is necessary to support good public transport. On the other hand, local governments as compact development, mixed-use development will allow the public transport investments to actually pay, hopefully, for themselves over time, and also to reap the kinds of benefits and growth that they can. The third thing is central government privatization of housing. I mean social housing in this case. Social housing being housing for less fortunate people who can't afford housing in the primary market. And finally, the Kiwi dream of a quarter acre, which of course is basically about that house on a nice plot of land. It's an ideal, but it's also people are wed to this ideal, and it influences the way they think about public transportation and urban development. I say over here tower blocks to serve evolving demand. The word tower block is not a pleasant term. I probably should say just higher density housing. So the critical factors of governance structure, reform, amalgamation. Alternative agendas have a greater voice now at the national level. And a specific example is that the National Party had previously outright opposed the CBD rail loop, and then after amalgamation and after enough sort of political wrangling, and finally announced hesitant support, although it is trying to push the start date back as far as possible. There are various reasons that they're probably trying to do that. But it does show how institutional change has affected administrative balance and therefore policy. Now the final thing about this first case, not every case is this long, is I wanted a framework to examine the dynamics between the central and the local governments. Now I started with the I-80 framework, which you may be familiar with, of Ostrom's, part of what earned her the Nobel Prize in 2009. So in the I-80 framework and action arena, we basically talk about the interactions between various groups and individuals to accomplish certain outcomes in sort of a collective action sense. Now, this doesn't say too much about the difference in scale between local and national, so I had to find a framework that would do so. Now, this framework is used for transboundary water governance, but the value that we get out of this is national and regional. It is talking about a national level examination of stakeholders and institutions versus a regional level stakeholder institutional examination. And when we combine them, that's what we get. So I've combined these for this framework for urban governance. So we talk about the political economies of urban governance at the local and regional scale, and then at the national scale. So taking this framework allows us to break out the 2 levels of analysis, local and national, and to look at the particular dimensions within each of them. the physical condition, what we're talking about, the rules in use, particularly administrative processes, and the various attributes of the good attributes of the community. And the action arena, of course, includes the action situation and the various actors. So the framework is not a theory. The framework is a collection of variables to study. And out of this collection of variables, we can draw relationships between variables to create hypotheses, test those hypotheses, and ultimately generate a theory. So this is not in itself a theory, it's simply a way to analyze, and this is how I've done so in case 1. Case 2, Thailand industrial estates. In Thailand, there's been rapid rural and peri-urban, quote, industrialization. The city of Bangkok, mainly, is highly congested, it's getting more expensive, land is scarce. And the country has sought a decentralized, geographically decentralized development process where it targets other areas around the country as growth nodes. What this means is that there's rapid industrialization in places that previously have not experienced it, namely rural areas, areas that have traditionally been reliant on agriculture. And as you might imagine, rapid industrialization in those places brings social, environmental, and economic impacts that they have never previously had to deal with. So what we see in this case is a poor management of environmental and public health impacts of pollution. So this is partly an institutional failing at the national and arguably even the local levels. And we have political contention as well. There is a national growth vision that says more industry is better, raise GDP. And yet at the local level, they are losing some of their traditional livelihoods. So this is what I call the nationalization of benefits. In other words, GDP rises for the entire nation and therefore accrues credibility to the party in power, which seems to change a lot of the time now. And then the localization of costs. So there has to be a cost for this industrial development. There's an environmental cost, there's a social cost. These are borne at the local levels, but these local levels don't necessarily always benefit from what's occurring at the national level. They don't always gain from the economic benefits at the national level. So that's the argument that I'm going at. My findings here are that the feedback from the citizens and advocacy groups basically complaining about the pollution is under-institutionalized. Thailand is a, quote, democracy. Some of these activist groups have successfully brought lawsuits to the national level to halt the construction of industrial estates. And in one case, this was successful, and industrial estate construction halted for almost a year, but it resumed. So what has happened is the introduction of token consultation programs. The appearance, or we should say maybe democracy theater, the appearance that people have a say in the types of policies that are impacting the environment, and yet they aren't necessarily producing the results that we expect to see. So the grassroots initiatives, as I say, produce only halting and inconsistent policy results. My methods are document analysis and first-hand interviews for a couple of years in Thailand. And the connection between public administration and institutional forces is evident. So opposing development strategies, national and local. Institutional forces are those citizen activist groups and the reliance on traditional methods of economy. And connection between institutional norms and administrative structure and policy making. So emphasizing evidence over ideology. And this has been a big problem in this case. There is evidence that cancer rates have gone up in these small towns that are hosting these large industrial estates. Nonetheless, this evidence is either controverted or it is ignored in policy-making processes, and it seems as though only token initiatives have been done to try to address not just cancer, but also there was in 2012 an explosion of a chemical plant which killed many workers, these types of things, so a failure possibly of regulation. So what I've done here is to, again, narrow the scope of analysis. So agglomeration, which is a national level development agenda, agglomerated in certain growth poles. Peru's growth poles refers to if we envision a country that is, say, the size of this screen, certain growth nodes are kind of all over it to decentralize. Industrial estates is an analytical level down, local regional manifestation of the national agenda. And then within that, the institutions, in other words, stakeholders, government, business, community, and the various debates they have amongst themselves about the type of development. And finally, we get down to individual management, public, private, and internal management. Many of these estates are sort of public-private partnerships, or the state has built the nation has built the estate, and then the private organization will come in behind that and assume managerial responsibility. And this is where some of the breakdowns occur. So that's the second case. My third case is the California foreclosure crisis, something I work on for quite a bit. So changing gears here. In California, as in many other states, during and right before the global financial crisis, a spate of home foreclosures hit particularly low-income areas. People were evicted from their homes as they were unable to refinance their mortgages. So I won't go into too many of the details of what caused this. What you can think of is that many people got into mortgages that they could not afford over the long run, particularly as the interest rates started to vary, and they were ultimately evicted from their homes with social and economic consequences for the localities and the regions. These, as I say, disproportionate impacts on low-income households and disruption of communities. We found in this research that there was this thing called predatory lending, which was a term that was thrown around a whole lot in 2007, 2008, and 2009. Basically targeting low-information clients, low-information people who maybe wouldn't necessarily understand all the terms of their mortgages. It's a very complicated process because a loan originator may try to get a client into a very large mortgage, into a very large house, into a very large mortgage, because that loan originator takes a cut or a commission off of, it's based on the value. So the higher the value that you get somebody into, the higher the commission you have. But once that mortgage is written, it becomes the bank's business, and it's not the originator's business anymore. And even banks will resell the mortgages in the secondary mortgage markets. So local governments weren't prepared to manage the impacts of this foreclosure crisis, and these impacts spread into regional areas. So after interviews and analysis of technical data, we determined that the adequacy of the protective systems needed improvement. And with the institutional forces at play, in other words, citizen activist groups, of which there was a lot in California. California is a very citizen activist, grassrootsy kind of place. They were able to bring their concerns to at least the local government and affect some real substantive policy change, which actually protects residents, renters, from being evicted out of foreclosed homes, to help stabilize the environment economically and socially. And the connection between the reflection of institutional norms and administrative structure, again in California, it's a highly democratized environment. The government of Richmond, the mayor, appeared to be very responsive to the concerns of these citizens, and the policy making then reflected the evidence that these citizens were being discriminated against. Just an example here, nothing to make it too complicated, but this is the type of data that we were looking at in this study. So what we have here, if you can read the bars, basically what this is saying is there is a racial component to these lending patterns. And the African American community was particularly impacted by the dispersal of these mortgages. We call them subprime mortgages because they have high interest rates, because they're risky, and they have variable interest rates, which means your payment can go up and down from month to month, which is very destabilizing to a household that's not making very much money. So we found evidence of this across the various banks. This is public information. And then on the right we have the percent of prime loans, not subprime, by ethnicity. So what we see here, as expected, would be white people, and in one case by Bank of America, the Latino population are most likely to receive prime loans. In other words, the good types of loans, the ones that don't vary. Whereas we see African Americans have been poorly represented in receiving these types of loans. So this was a particularly political issue. It's a very emotional issue as well. I recall being a part of a town hall meeting after we produced a report, and it was packed. It was a small Catholic church, and mayor was there, and the city council was there, and we had invited bank representatives, but I don't believe any showed up. And there was a lot of sort of torch and pitchfork kind of activism, and it produced a result. It produced a tenancy protection bill in the government. So just real quick, I'll go through here. Evidence-based policy development, which is really what the story was about. Talking about qualitative versus quantitative. In this case, to combine the two of them is very critical. We hear a lot about mixed methodologies, mixed methods in research now to complement the qualitative and the quantitative. And in this case, it was particularly helpful because there was a sort of a person, or should I say, emotional-based, human aspect to this whole story. And the qualitative research definitely picked that up. The quantitative, which I just showed you, was fairly convincing as well. The data sources, bank data, luckily from an institutional point of view, there is access to certain data based on, in America, based on certain laws that have been put into place, and other data from interviews and research centers. And another issue here was values versus evidence. And in this case, there was little conflict between the value and the evidence. Majority of the people, or many of the people in the town, had been negatively impacted. Their values were such that they felt that there was discrimination present in bank loan processes, and therefore the evidence supported what they had presumed about these patterns. And this progressive political stance created a receptive environment at the local government level to addressing some of these grievances through the policy process. And finally, there's a local national component as well. In this case, the Tenancy Protection Act can be a model for other cities around the country. There are, of course, many cities in America that have been affected by the mortgage crisis. Detroit, etc., Cleveland. It's not just Richmond, which, by the way, is located in San Francisco, a very wealthy city. It's a national issue, but California was a hot spot, and therefore what happens in California at the policy level is often the bellwether for what will happen in other places at the policy level. Things that occur in California are usually the first two, and then other places follow suit. But in this case, not always. The final case is fracking. You may know this term from your sort of energy science studies. Fracking is hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing refers to a controversial method of extracting oil and gas resources from under the ground, what they call shale deposits. In other words, oil and gas resources are locked up in deposits of rock far underground, and they cannot be accessed with the traditional technologies. So recently, in the last couple of decades, is the proliferation of this revolutionary approach to extracting this, which is basically sending underground combinations of chemicals and sand and creating miniature earthquakes to release the gas from between the rocks. And then this gas comes to surface. Now this is part of what has made America now, I believe, one of the leading exporters now of natural gas. I mean, it shot up immensely after this technology was introduced. And it has obviously been a big boon to the economy in many places in America. Whether it has impacted the recent oil price fall is hard to say, but I'm sure there are those who would argue that. So it's the rapid adoption of fracking techniques, uncertain environmental and public health impacts, however, and this is really the crux of the issue. Groundwater contamination, surface level runoff contamination, air pollution. You may have heard of this movie that documented, was it Gasland, I believe? It documented fracking in Colorado, and I believe in one scene they had a lady in her house and she turned on the faucet, and it just came out brown. And I think in one instance she was able to light it on fire or something. It was just something very odd like that. I mean, these are obviously anecdotal cases, and not everybody's experiencing everywhere. But these are the types of concerns that are being discussed in communities that have adopted this. So the findings are that many governments are scrambling to enact ad hoc regulations. They don't understand the technology necessarily that well. And in some cases, the legislation, as it is in many instances, has to be written by the experts, and the experts come from the industry. So one could presume, possibly, that the type of policies that are getting considered are actually more beneficial to the producers than they are to the people who are receiving the impacts. The policy response has been mixed across local and state governments. Arguably falls along political lines. A place like Texas has not banned fracking. There's much fracking in Texas. I believe the city of Dallas did institute a fracking ban, but the city of Dallas tends to be a little more to the left than the general Texas state government. Colorado has also gone through issues of trying to determine whether and how much to regulate fracking or even to eliminate it altogether. So what is the sticking point? It's the interpretation of evidence. So as I say here, it's a politically divisive exercise. It's like climate change. Climate change has come around as an issue that most politicians are probably willing to acknowledge, but there are a few in America who are still unwilling to acknowledge the presence of climate change. In the case of fracking as well, it is a little bit uncertain exactly how bad it's impacting the environment and the livelihoods of people. So there are my methods, and the contribution here is that the local and state authority, public administration, and overlapping jurisdictions, which makes it problematic. Say if a city bans fracking, but then the state bans the ban of fracking, then what the city has done is immaterial. So it's sort of a dog-eat-dog kind of thing, or the bigger fish sort of analogy. The institutional forces are the citizen priorities and the grassroots democracy, which in America we could say is a, quote, highly democratized system, although you can debate that. In other places like New Zealand and in Europe, democratized systems have been receptive to the negative reactions of citizens and advocacy groups, and in some cases have instituted, even in Bulgaria in one case, have instituted laws against fracking. So in this case, I have emphasized that the evidence over ideology debate is certainly front and center. As I said, some of this, the political context is multi-layered governance, some balance in political institution between corporate lobbying and grassroots advocacy. These are basically the two at opposite ends of the table here. The policy substance. So the adoption of fracking is motivated by real quick profits, energy security, which is a rhetorical argument, right? So given what's going on in the instability in the Middle East, it is very politically expedient in America to say, I support energy security, which means that we can produce everything that we consume and we don't have to rely on other people. It's a very powerful political argument. And lower energy costs to the consumer, which all you have to do is say it's going to be cheaper, and you've got your political support lined up pretty much already. But as I said, uncertain environmental impacts, and it's I believe, in my opinion, sort of a shoot now, ask questions later. We sort of take advantage of this while we can, and get as much out of it until we really start discovering what the negative impacts are. For instance, in Oklahoma, there's been a massive rise in the number of earthquakes. And some people believe that this is caused by the fracking that's going on. There's an immense amount of fracking in Oklahoma because of the shale gas deposits there. So finally, this is the final slide of the cases. I used a couple of frameworks to look at this, the Kington and the Saboteur and Smith. Multiple streams framework, I believe we had the intersection of problem politics, for sure. The problem was the emergence of the evidence, for instance, dirty drinking water. Grassroots action was sort of the politics stream, and how the grassroots action percolated up to the policy level. But the policy stream was least likely, and that's because, again, I said there are those overlapping jurisdictions. If you look at all sorts of issues that are controversial in America, this case is particularly U.S. focused. You look at certain issues that are often elevated up to the national level that aren't necessarily appropriate for local governments to decide. One issue is civil rights. Another issue is voting. Do women get to vote? Do people of all races deserve equal civil rights? Well, if we took votes on these types of things at the local and state level, we might have variability in civil rights across states. We might have variability in voting laws across states. But to bring it to the national level is to say we have a universal standard. And we're seeing this now with the gay marriage debate as well. Individual states are deciding, but there are cases before the Supreme Court that will make it sort of universally applicable. In a case like this, it's probably unlikely that the federal government is going to institute a fracking policy. We'll primarily leave that up to the states. But that's why the policy stream, I could say, is probably not necessarily there, except at the very local level. Now, the Advocacy Coalition Framework, we know it just talks about beliefs. Beliefs is a binding mechanism that facilitate the formation of coalitions around particular political issues. So this explains how evidence influences changes in belief patterns. So as new evidence emerges, maybe belief patterns change, maybe coalitions either change their positions or they reorder themselves. However, in this case, lack of evidence, or I should say a lack of conclusive evidence, or at least the debate about evidence, obstructs anti-fracking advocacy efforts because there's no hard evidence to go on. And the prospect of changing the beliefs of the pro-fracking contingent is also lessened, or is also reduced because of the lack of evidence. So conclusions and lessons. In the conclusion, I discuss what I call a constraint theory of governance. So the optimization of particular functions, policy making, regulation, you can fill in a lot, and or the dimensions of policy making, so the processes, the collaboration, the level of democratization, what gets voted on and what doesn't. You can optimize these particular functions, but with the failure to understand the value of the complementarity of these various functions, there is not going to be very substantive reform. So to optimize one process, I talk about a gentleman named Goldrat, who wrote a book in 1984 called The Goal. Now he was talking about industrial production. In industrial production, if you think of the line, like along this table, and each spot is something else happens to the good that's being produced. Here the good gets cut, here it gets molded, here it gets painted, here it gets packaged. So if you're focusing on one of these things, you may invest a lot of time or effort to improve your painting, or to improve the speed of your painting. But unless the other systems are improved, then it will do you no good. Your throughput does not actually go up. And this is what I'm talking about with government. So to focus particularly into certain areas, which is often the idea behind reforms, fails to recognize that there needs to be a complementarity among all these things, which, yes, is the most difficult type of reform to undertake, because it does get involved with every system of government, but it is probably and arguably the only one that will create any outcome. The post-partisan government system that I mentioned here should target the institutional adaptability, administrative pragmatism, which I say goes beyond the ideological